A millionaire took his 18-year-old mistress home right after his wife's funeral. The next day, when reading the will, he collapsed at what she had done with the fortune. From riches to redemption, a powerful story about a millionaire who betrayed his dying wife for an 18-year-old mistress, only to discover that his late wife had planned the most extraordinary lesson of his life. When the will was read, he collapsed at what she had done with their fortune. A tale of justice, transformation, and the true meaning of wealth that will make you believe in the power of second chances. Some lessons come at a great cost, but they can change lives forever. Richard Miller stood at the window of his penthouse office in downtown Chicago, his stern reflection overlapping the spectacular view of his real estate empire below. At 65, he had everything money could buy, except peace of mind. His phone buzzed again, another call from the hospital. For the third time that morning, he declined it. "Mr. Miller," his secretary's voice crackled through the intercom. "Your daughter Julia called again. She says it's urgent about Mrs. Miller." "Tell her I'm in a meeting," he replied curtly, his eyes fixed on the coffee shop across the street. That's where he had first seen Ashley 3 months ago. Just 18, with striking features and an infectious smile, she had served him coffee every morning since then. So different from the dreary hospital visits with Margaret. His phone buzzed again, this time a text message from Ashley. "Can't wait to see you tonight." A smile crept across his face as he typed back, completely forgetting about the hospital calls. At that exact moment, his daughter Julia was holding her mother's hand as the doctor delivered the devastating news. The cancer had spread. Margaret Miller had less than 6 months to live. Richard's mind drifted to his early days, long before he became one of Chicago's most powerful real estate developers. He had arrived in the city with nothing but determination and dreams, hiding a shameful secret. He could barely read or write. Now, he controlled billions in real estate holdings, his company's logo adorning some of the city's most prestigious buildings. His phone rang again. "Julia?" "Dad, where are you?" "Mom's doctor." "I told Sandra to let you know I'm in meetings all day," he interrupted, watching Ashley serve customers below. "Dad, this is important." "The cancer." A text from Ashley popped up. "What should I wear tonight?" "Julia, I'll call you back," he said hastily, hanging up to respond to Ashley's message. In the hospital room, Julia stared at her phone in disbelief. She had left her executive position in New York to help care for her mother, and now she could hardly recognize her father anymore. Something had changed in him over the past few months. The day continued with Richard orchestrating deals and ignoring calls, while periodically glancing at the coffee shop below. When evening came, he packed his briefcase, straightened his expensive tie, and headed down. Ashley was waiting outside, her youth and beauty drawing admiring glances from passers-by. Richard felt a surge of pride as he approached her. "Mr. Miller," she smiled, her voice sweet and admiring. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it." "Please, call me Richard," he said, leading her to his waiting car. "I made reservations at Chicago's finest restaurant." As they drove away, his phone buzzed one final time. The hospital again. He turned it off without a second thought. Meanwhile, in a sterile hospital room, Margaret Miller lay quietly, her once vibrant face now pale and drawn. Julia sat beside her, holding her hand. "Did you reach your father?" Margaret asked weakly. Julia squeezed her mother's hand, fighting back tears. "He's in meetings, Mom. He said he'll call back." Margaret nodded slowly, a knowing look in her eyes. After 30 years of marriage, she understood more than anyone realized. But instead of anger or bitterness, a different emotion flickered across her face. Determination. "Julia, dear," she said softly, "tomorrow I need you to call Harold, our family lawyer. There are some arrangements I need to make." "What arrangements, Mom?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Just some paperwork that needs to be taken care of. Everything will make sense in time." Across town, Richard raised a champagne glass with Ashley, both of them laughing, while his phone lay silent in his pocket, the hospital's urgent messages unread and ignored. 5 years earlier, the Chicago Convention Center was packed as Margaret Miller accepted the National Education Achievement Award. Her innovative literacy program had transformed thousands of lives across America. Standing at the podium, she spoke with the same warmth she brought to every classroom. Education isn't just about reading and writing, she told the audience. It's about dignity. It's about giving people the tools to change their own lives. Among the attendees, successful businessmen and professionals wiped tears as they remembered their own journey with Mrs. Miller. Mark Stevens, now a prominent surgeon, stood up to share his story. 20 years ago, I was a high school dropout cleaning offices at night, he said. Mrs. Miller found me trying to read medical pamphlets during my shift. Instead of embarrassing me, she offered to help. Today, I perform life-saving surgeries because one teacher cared enough to believe in me. Julia, watching from the front row, beamed with pride. Her mother had touched so many lives while remaining humble about her achievements. Even now, Margaret spent her retirement volunteering at community centers, continuing her mission to help others. But that day at the convention center felt like a lifetime ago. Now, Margaret sat in a hospital room as her doctor delivered the latest test results. The first round of chemotherapy isn't producing the results we hoped for, he explained gently. We need to consider more aggressive treatment options. Julia held her mother's hand, noticing how fragile it felt. I'll be here for every session, Mom. I've already arranged to work remotely. You shouldn't have left your position in New York, Margaret protested weakly. The company will survive without me, Julia assured her. Family comes first. Later that afternoon, Richard called to say he couldn't make it to the hospital. Another important meeting. Margaret nodded understanding, but Julia saw the hurt in her eyes. While Margaret underwent her treatment, Richard sat at the coffee shop across from his office, captivated by Ashley's attention as she served him premium roast coffee. You've built such an amazing empire, Mr. Miller, Ashley said admiringly. I read all about you in business magazines. Richard straightened his tie, basking in her praise. Please, call me Richard. Would you like to hear more about it over dinner? That evening, as Margaret lay exhausted from chemotherapy, Richard and Ashley shared their first intimate dinner at an exclusive restaurant. He enjoyed how she hung on his every word, so different from Margaret's quiet wisdom. At the hospital, Julia noticed the changes in her father, the missed appointments, the constant meetings, the way he barely looked at her mother anymore. Something was different, but she couldn't quite figure out what. Margaret, however, seemed focused on something else. Between treatments, she made numerous phone calls to Harold, their family lawyer. She also spent hours writing in a notebook, stopping only when visitors entered the room. Just updating some old teaching materials, she would say with a slight smile. One day, a former student visited Margaret in the hospital. Sarah Chen, now a successful publisher, brought flowers and news about her literacy foundation. Your program is still changing lives, Mrs. Miller, Sarah said. Last month, we helped 50 adults get their high school equivalency. Margaret's eyes lit up. That's wonderful, Sarah. Education is the greatest gift we can give. It opens doors that people never knew existed. Julia watched her mother's enthusiasm, amazed at how she could still think of helping others while fighting her own battle. But she also noticed how Margaret quickly hid her notebook when Richard finally showed up for a brief visit. That evening, Richard met Ashley again, this time at her apartment. As she admired his expensive watch and asked questions about his business empire, Margaret lay in her hospital bed, quietly writing in her notebook. Mom, what are you working on? Julia asked. Margaret looked up with a gentle smile. Just making sure everything is in order, dear. Sometimes the best lessons take careful planning. Julia didn't understand what her mother meant, but something in Margaret's voice suggested she had a purpose, one that would become clear in time. Down the street from the hospital, Richard laughed at another of Ashley's admiring comments, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. As Margaret's condition worsened, Richard's absences became more frequent. While Julia spent her days navigating hospital corridors and consulting with doctors, her father's chair beside Margaret's bed remained empty. Another meeting? Julia asked when Richard called to cancel yet again. The Anderson deal needs my attention, he replied, already adjusting his tie for dinner with Ashley. Julia watched her mother endure another chemotherapy session alone. Margaret never complained about Richard's absence, but her eyes told a different story. Across town at the Four Seasons restaurant, Harold Matthews, the Miller family's lawyer for 20 years, couldn't believe what he was seeing. Richard Miller sat at a corner table, holding hands with a girl young enough to be his granddaughter. Harold almost dropped his fork when he heard Richard introduce Ashley to the waiter as his special friend. Taking out his phone, he discreetly snapped a photo. The next morning, Harold hired Tom Baker, a private investigator he trusted. "Find out everything you can about this girl," he instructed, showing him the photo. While Tom began his investigation, Richard's relationship with Ashley grew bolder. They were spotted at high-end restaurants, theaters, and exclusive clubs. Ashley now carried a designer purse and wore expensive jewelry, all gifts from Richard. "Your husband has been very generous," Tom reported to Harold a week later, laying out his findings. He bought her an apartment downtown and set up a monthly allowance. But that wasn't all. Tom's investigation revealed a pattern. Ashley Williams, age 18. "She's done this before," he explained, spreading out documents. 3 other wealthy men in different cities. Each time, she got close to them, received expensive gifts, then threatened to expose their relationships unless they paid her off. Harold listened intently, taking notes. "Any contact with tabloids?" "Already started," Tom confirmed. "She's been talking to reporters, planning to sell her story about her whirlwind romance with Chicago's real estate tycoon." Meanwhile, Margaret called Harold to her hospital room. Julia was surprised to see her mother so energized despite her weakened state. "Harold, it's time to put our plan in motion," Margaret said, pulling out her notebook. "Have you confirmed everything we discussed?" Harold nodded, glancing at Julia. "Are you sure you want to proceed this way?" "It's not about revenge," Margaret explained, her voice firm. "It's about justice and protecting what matters most." For the next several hours, Margaret, Harold, and a team of legal experts worked on documents, making calls and finalizing arrangements. Julia watched, confused but trusting her mother's judgment. At the same time, Richard was in Ashley's new apartment, completely unaware of what was happening. "You're so much more understanding than Margaret," he told her. "You appreciate a man's need for success." Ashley smiled, sending a quick text to her tabloid contact when Richard wasn't looking. "Tell me more about your latest deal," she purred, recording the conversation on her hidden phone. Back at the hospital, Harold shared the complete file on Ashley with Margaret. She read through it calmly, showing no surprise at the revelations about the woman who had stolen her husband's attention. "Everything is ready," Harold confirmed. "The papers are drawn up exactly as you requested. Are you absolutely certain about this?" Margaret looked at her daughter, then back at Harold. "Some lessons require careful planning, Harold. Richard needs to learn this one." Julia still didn't understand what was happening, but she noticed a new strength in her mother's eyes. The same look she had when tackling a particularly challenging student. "Mom, what are you planning?" Julia asked after Harold left. Margaret took her daughter's hand. "Sometimes, dear, the best teaching moments come from allowing people to face the consequences of their choices. Your father is about to learn a very important lesson." As evening fell, Richard ignored another hospital call, too engrossed in Ashley's flattery to notice that his world was slowly being reorganized around him. Margaret's plan was in motion, and nothing would stop the wheels of justice she had set turning. In her hospital room, Margaret closed her notebook with a satisfied smile. The real estate tycoon who had built an empire but forgotten his foundations was about to receive the most important education of his life. Margaret Miller passed away quietly in her sleep on a Tuesday morning with Julia holding her hand. When the hospital called, Richard was at breakfast with Ashley. He didn't answer until the third attempt. The funeral service at Grace Cathedral drew hundreds of mourners. Former students, many now successful professionals, filled the pews. The governor sent a representative. 3 news crews waited outside, covering the passing of Chicago's beloved educator. "Where's Dad?" Julia asked Harold, scanning the crowd 15 minutes after the service was supposed to begin. Right then, a murmur spread through the cathedral. Richard Miller walked in late, with Ashley on his arm. She wore a bright red dress that stood out sharply against the mourners. Dark attire. "Is he serious?" whispered Mark Stevens, the surgeon whose life Margaret had changed. Other former students exchanged shocked glances. Ashley's heels clicked loudly on the floor as she followed Richard to the front row, where she sat in Margaret's usual spot at church. She immediately pulled out her phone and started typing. Julia stood up, her hands shaking. "That's my mother's place." "Julia, sit down," Richard hissed. "Don't make a scene." "A scene?" Julia's voice carried through the quiet cathedral. "You bring your teenage girlfriend to Mom's funeral and you're worried about a scene?" Ashley looked up from her phone with a smirk. "I'm here to support Richard during this difficult time, and actually, I have exciting news for everyone." She stood up, addressing the stunned congregation. "Richard and I are planning a reality show about our life together. It's called Love Knows No Age, a Chicago romance. The producers are already redecorating the mansion for filming next week." The cathedral erupted in whispers. Camera phones emerged. Julia saw several reporters outside already typing frantically on their phones. "Get out," Julia's voice cut through the chaos. "Get out of my mother's church. Get out of her seat. Get out of her funeral." "Julia," Richard started, but Harold placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Richard," Harold said quietly, "for once in your life, show some respect." Ashley stood up, adjusting her dress. "Whatever. The lighting in here is terrible for filming anyway. Richard, call me when this is over. We need to discuss the show's premiere party." As she clicked her way down the aisle, former students moved away from her as if she were toxic. Outside, reporters swarmed her immediately. She posed for photos, already playing to the cameras. The service proceeded without further interruption. One by one, Margaret's former students shared stories of how she changed their lives. Richard sat alone in the front row, Ashley's empty seat beside him a glaring symbol of his choices. "Mrs. Miller taught me to read when I was 40 years old," said James Porter, now a successful business owner. "She never made me feel ashamed. She said it's never too late to learn, never too late to change." After the service at the cemetery, Richard tried to stand next to Julia. She moved away, standing instead with Harold and a group of Margaret's former students. "The mansion needs to be ready for filming by next week," Richard announced as they left the cemetery. "The producers want to capture our new life together." "New life?" Julia turned to face her father. "Mom's been gone for 6 hours, and you're already planning your reality show?" "Julia, you don't understand. Ashley and I—" "No, you don't understand," Julia interrupted. "But you will. Tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. at the mansion, Harold will read Mom's will. Don't be late." As Richard drove away to meet Ashley, Julia stayed behind at her mother's grave with Harold. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" she asked. Harold nodded. "Your mother planned everything perfectly, though I doubt Richard or his young friend will appreciate her final lesson." Julia touched her mother's headstone. Even in death, Margaret Miller remained a teacher. And tomorrow would be her most important lesson yet. The morning after the funeral, Harold arrived early at the Miller mansion, carrying a thick briefcase. Julia was already waiting in the library. "Before your father arrives," Harold said, placing several files on the mahogany desk, "there's something you need to see." He opened the first folder, revealing a detailed investigation into Ashley Williams. "Your mother asked me to look into Ms. Williams 3 months ago. What we found was illuminating." Julia read through the documents, her eyes widening. 3 different cities, 3 different men. "All following the same pattern," Harold confirmed. "She finds wealthy older men, usually married, gets close to them, receives expensive gifts, money, apartments, then comes the extortion." He pulled out more papers. "Milwaukee, 2023, she threatened to expose a bank president. Settlement $500,000. Detroit, 2023, a retired CEO. Settlement $750,000. Cleveland, early 2024, a judge. Settlement $1.2 million. And now my father," Julia said, understanding dawning on her face. "Your mother knew everything," Harold continued. "She had me hire the best investigators. Every detail, every transaction, every tabloid contact, she knew it all." A new file revealed Ashley's recent activities. "She's already contacted 3 major tabloids," Harold explained, offering exclusive stories about her epic romance with Richard. "She's negotiating a reality show deal. And she's been recording all her conversations with your father." Julia sat back, stunned. "Did Mom confront Dad about this?" "No," Harold smiled slightly. "Margaret had a different plan. But first, there's something else you need to know about your father." He pulled out an old document, a literacy assessment from 30 years ago. Your father came to Chicago barely able to read or write. He hid it well, but he was functionally illiterate. Julia stared at the paper. What? But his business empire was built on your mother's help, Harold finished. Every night, after teaching at school, she taught your father. Basic reading first, then business documents, contracts, everything he needed. He showed Julia more papers. Early contracts with Margaret's handwriting in the margins, explaining complex terms to Richard. Study materials she created specifically for him. Notes she took in business meetings when Richard was too embarrassed to admit he couldn't read fast enough. She never told anyone, Harold said. She protected his pride while giving him the tools to succeed. Even when he started earning millions, she kept teaching at her school, helping others achieve their dreams too. The sound of cars pulling up interrupted them. Through the window, they saw Richard arriving with Ashley. Your mother knew this day would come, Harold said quickly. She spent her last months preparing everything. The will we're about to read, it's not just about money. It's her final lesson. What kind of lesson? The kind that only Margaret Miller could teach, Harold replied, organizing his papers as footsteps approached the library. Watch carefully. Your mother's about to teach from beyond the grave. Richard entered with Ashley, who immediately started taking pictures of the library with her phone. This room needs to go, she announced. The producers want something more modern for our show. Harold cleared his throat. Miss Williams, this is a private family matter. I must ask you to wait outside. I'm Richard's future wife, she declared. I have every right to be here. Future wife? Julia stood up. Mom's been dead for 1 day. Actually, Harold interrupted, opening another file. I think Miss Williams should stay. She might find the next few minutes educational. Richard sat down, looking annoyed. Let's get this over with. I have producers waiting to discuss the show. Of course, Harold said, putting on his reading glasses. Margaret was very specific about how this meeting should proceed, and like any good teacher, she prepared her material thoroughly. He opened the final folder, and Margaret's last lesson began. The library fell silent as Harold began reading Margaret's will. The only sound was Ashley's fingers tapping on her phone, until Harold paused and stared at her until she put it away. First, Harold announced, Mrs. Miller established the Margaret Miller Educational Foundation with an initial endowment of $50 million. Richard's head snapped up. $50 million? That's impossible. Margaret didn't have that kind of money. On the contrary, Harold continued, Mrs. Miller's personal inheritance from her parents was quite substantial. She chose to live modestly while investing wisely over the years. Julia watched her father's face as Harold read on. The foundation will provide educational opportunities for underprivileged students across Chicago with a special focus on adult literacy programs. Ashley raised her hand like a schoolgirl. But what about the mansion? We need it for our show. Harold ignored her. Regarding the Miller estate holdings, Margaret Miller was the majority shareholder of Miller Enterprises. What? Richard stood up. That's ridiculous. I built this company. Please let me finish, Harold said firmly. Through a series of legal transactions over the past 20 years, Margaret acquired controlling interest in Miller Enterprises, all perfectly documented and legal. He passed copies of stock certificates and transfer documents to everyone present. Richard stared at them in disbelief. The ownership of Miller Enterprises will transfer immediately to Julia Miller, who will assume the position of CEO and chairperson of the board. This is impossible, Richard shouted. I'll contest it. You can try, Harold replied calmly, but every transaction was properly executed with your signature on each document. Would you like me to read them aloud? Richard fell silent, his face pale. To my husband, Richard Miller, Harold continued reading, I leave 10% of my personal fortune with one condition. You may never interfere with the company's operations or attempt to influence its management in any way. Ashley grabbed Richard's arm. 10% of $50 million is still $5 million, baby. We can work with that. Actually, Harold corrected her, the 10% is approximately $2 million after taxes. The $50 million for the foundation came from company shares. Ashley's smile faded. $2 million? That's it? Furthermore, Harold pressed on, the mansion transfers to Julia's ownership, effective immediately. Ashley jumped up. But our show, the producers are coming tomorrow. I'm afraid, Julia spoke for the first time, you'll need to find another filming location. This is all lies. Richard slammed his fist on the desk. Margaret would never do this to me. There's more, Harold said. A personal letter from Margaret to be read now. He opened a sealed envelope, but Richard stood up. I don't need to hear this. Ashley, we're leaving. Sit down, Dad, Julia ordered. For once in your life, listen to what Mom has to say. Richard sat, his face a mask of anger and confusion. One more thing before the letter, Harold added. Mrs. Miller left extensive documentation about Ms. Williams' previous activities in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Cleveland, including her previous legal settlements and current tabloid negotiations. Ashley's face went white. She grabbed her phone and headed for the door. Miss Williams, Harold called after her. I should mention that Mrs. Miller's investigators documented everything. Everything. I've already forwarded copies to the producers you've been meeting with. Ashley fled the library, her heels clicking rapidly down the hallway. Now, Harold said, unfolding Margaret's letter, shall we hear what Margaret wanted to say to her family? Julia reached for her father's hand, but he pulled away, staring at the floor. The lesson wasn't over yet, and the hardest part was still to come. Harold adjusted his glasses and began reading Margaret's letter. My dear family, if you're hearing this, then my final lesson is ready to begin. Richard, for 30 years I've kept your secret. Now it's time for the truth to be part of your legacy. Richard's face drained of color. Julia leaned forward, listening intently. When Richard Miller arrived in Chicago, he had big dreams but couldn't read above a 4th grade level. He hid it well. Every contract, every document, every business proposal. I read them all to him at night, teaching him word by word. Harold paused as Richard buried his face in his hands. I didn't just teach him to read, I taught him business terminology, contract law, real estate regulations. Every night for years after teaching at my school, I would teach my husband. The empire he built started with those lessons at our kitchen table. Julia stared at her father, understanding dawning on her face. I never told anyone because I respected his pride. But pride, Richard, became your weakness. You forgot where you came from. You forgot what it means to struggle. Most importantly, you forgot who helped you climb. The letter continued, Margaret's words filling the silent library. I knew about Ashley from the beginning. I knew about the apartment, the gifts, the plans for a reality show. I knew everything. But instead of confronting you, I decided to give you one final lesson about values. Richard stood up, pacing the room. Your young friend has quite a history, Richard. 3 cities, 3 wealthy men, 3 extortion attempts. She's been recording your conversations and negotiating with tabloids. By now, she's probably running to call her lawyers. As if on cue, they heard the mansion's front door slam. But this isn't about punishment, Richard. It's about education. Something I've dedicated my life to. You built an empire but lost your soul. You gained wealth but forgot your values. Harold turned the page, continuing. To Julia, I leave not just the company, but a challenge. Make it stand for something more than profit. The foundation will help others like your father, people with dreams but without opportunities. Give them what I gave him, a chance to learn, to grow, to succeed. Julia wiped tears from her eyes as Harold read on. And Richard, my final lesson for you is this. True wealth isn't in your bank account. It's in the lives you touch, the people you help, the legacy you leave. I hope someday you remember that. Stop, Richard whispered, but Harold continued. Everything I did was legal. Every stock purchase, every transfer, every investment. You signed them all, Richard. You should have read them more carefully. Something you could do because I taught you how. Richard slumped in his chair as Harold reached the letter's end. My time as a teacher is over, but learning never stops. Julia will lead the company with compassion. The foundation will continue my life's work. And you, Richard, have a choice. Learn from this moment or let pride destroy you again. I love you both. Even now, even after everything. Love, Margaret. Harold folded the letter as silence filled the room. Suddenly, Julia's phone buzzed. She looked at it and laughed without humor. Ashley's already talking to the press. She's telling them Dad was taken advantage of by his late wife. I have a statement prepared for that, Harold said, pulling out another document. Your mother thought of everything. Richard stood up shakily. "I need to go." "Actually," Harold interjected, "there are quite a few documents you need to sign first. Transferring company control, updating board records, removing you from operational decisions. Your wife was quite thorough in her lesson plan." Julia watched as her father slumped back into his chair, finally ready to learn what Margaret had tried to teach him all along. 1 week after the reading of the will, Julia sat in what used to be her father's office at Miller Enterprises headquarters. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since news broke about the company's change in leadership. "The board members are waiting," her assistant announced. Julia straightened her back and walked into the conference room. 12 men in expensive suits stared back at her, most of them her father's old friends. "Gentlemen," she began, "things are going to change." "We've reviewed your proposals," George Parker, the longest-serving board member, interrupted. "And frankly, we're concerned. Social programs, employee education initiatives, this isn't a charity." Julia opened her laptop. "Let me show you something." She pulled up the company's financial records. "Under the previous leadership, we've had 3 SEC investigations in 5 years, 2 discrimination lawsuits, and a reputation for aggressive business tactics that's cost us major contracts." The board members shifted uncomfortably. "Starting today, Miller Enterprises will be known for more than just profits." She distributed folders to each member. "Our first initiative, every building we own will include affordable housing units. Our second, free education programs for all employees and their families." "This is ridiculous," Parker scoffed. "Richard would never." "Richard isn't in charge anymore." Julia cut him off. "Those who don't support our new direction are welcome to resign." 3 board members stood up and left. Julia continued as if nothing had happened. By lunchtime, word had spread through the company. Julia walked through the offices, introducing herself to employees her father had never bothered to meet. In the maintenance department, she found Tom, a janitor studying computer manuals during his break. "How would you like to join our new IT training program?" she asked him. News cameras were waiting outside when Julia left work. Headlines flashed across Chicago. "Miller Enterprises announces major changes, and daughter takes father's empire in new direction." Back in her office the next morning, Julia received an unexpected visitor. Sarah Chen, her mother's former student and now a successful publisher, walked in with a proposal. "I heard about your education initiatives," Sarah said. "My company wants to partner with Miller Enterprises. Free books and learning materials for all your programs." As they shook hands on the deal, Julia's assistant rushed in. "Your father's trying to access the company accounts. He's at the bank right now." Julia picked up the phone and called Harold. Within minutes, the attempt was blocked. The next week brought more changes. Julia fired executives who resisted the new direction. She hired people who shared her vision, including many of her mother's former students. The company's charitable foundation launched its first literacy program. But not everyone celebrated the changes. Richard began calling board members, trying to gather support against Julia's leadership. Some of his old business partners threatened to withdraw their investments. Julia stood firm. At a press conference, she announced the company's biggest change yet. 20% of all future profits would go to educational programs for underprivileged communities. The stock market responded with uncertainty, shares dropping 15%. Julia's phone rang constantly with concerned investors. Then something unexpected happened. Companies started reaching out, wanting to partner with Miller Enterprises. The public responded positively to the changes. Young talents began applying for jobs, attracted by the company's new values. 1 month into her leadership, Julia found a small note on her desk. It was from Maria, a cleaning lady whose daughter had just enrolled in the company's college program. "Thank you for giving my child a chance," it read. "Mrs. Miller would be proud." Julia pinned the note to her wall, right next to her mother's teaching awards. Outside her office, Miller Enterprises was transforming, one decision at a time. That evening, as she left work, Julia saw her father watching from across the street. He turned away quickly, but not before she noticed how tired and old he looked. His empire was changing, becoming something he never imagined, and perhaps something better than he could have built alone. 3 months into Julia's leadership, Richard launched his counterattack. He called an emergency meeting with his old investors at the Chicago Plaza Hotel. "She's destroying everything I built," Richard told the group of wealthy businessmen. "The company's lost millions in market value. We need to stop her." But his longtime associate, Frank Anderson, shook his head. "Times are changing, Richard. My own daughter won't stop talking about Miller Enterprises' new programs. They're getting more positive press than ever." "Press doesn't pay bills," Richard snapped. "We need to force her out." He outlined his plan. Key investors would withdraw their money simultaneously, creating a crisis of confidence. The board would have no choice but to remove Julia. The next morning, 5 major investors announced their withdrawal from Miller Enterprises. The stock dropped 20% in 1 hour. Business news channels buzzed with speculation about the company's future. Julia sat in her office, watching the stock ticker fall. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing with panicked shareholders. Then her assistant rushed in with unexpected news. "Warren Capital just bought all the withdrawn shares," she announced, "at premium price." Julia picked up the phone. On the other end was Susan Warren, the investment firm's CEO. "My mother was one of Margaret's first students," Susan explained. "We believe in what you're doing." By day's end, 3 more major investment firms had backed Miller Enterprises. The stock recovered completely. Richard wasn't finished. He contacted the company's biggest clients, suggesting Julia's inexperience would hurt their projects. But when he reached James Peterson, their largest commercial tenant, the response surprised him. "Actually," Peterson said, "we're expanding our lease. My wife's sister just enrolled in your education program. Best thing that's happened to our family." One by one, Richard's old allies turned away from him. His social circle shrunk. Country club friends stopped returning his calls. Even his old bank declined his lunch invitation. Desperate, he tried one last move. He called a press conference, planning to expose Julia's mismanagement. But only 2 reporters showed up. Meanwhile, across town, all major networks covered Julia's announcement of Miller Enterprises' latest initiative, a technology training center for underserved communities. That evening, Richard sat alone in his rented apartment, watching business news. The headline read, "Miller Enterprises sets new standard for corporate responsibility." The reporter spoke enthusiastically. "Under Julia Miller's leadership, the company has achieved something remarkable, growing profits while expanding social impact. Their education programs have already helped over 1,000 families." His phone buzzed. A text from Ashley. "Our story got rejected. Publishers say nobody cares anymore. Sorry, baby." Richard turned off the TV. Through his window, he could see the Miller Enterprises building, its logo shining against the night sky. The empire he built was transforming without him. The next morning, Julia received a report. Company morale was at an all-time high. Employee retention had improved by 40%. Applications for jobs had tripled. Then came another surprise. The governor's office called. They wanted Miller Enterprises to lead a statewide initiative for adult education. Julia's phone lit up with congratulatory messages from business leaders across the country. Richard watched it all from the sidelines, his influence fading with each passing day. His attempts at sabotage had backfired, making Julia's leadership look even stronger. At his usual coffee shop, not the one where he met Ashley, Richard overheard 2 businessmen discussing Miller Enterprises. "Best company transformation I've ever seen," one said. "The daughter's a genius." "Did you hear about their new program?" the other replied. "My cleaning lady's son just got a full scholarship." Richard got up and left without finishing his coffee. For the first time, he faced a harsh reality. He wasn't just losing his company, he was watching it become something better without him. 6 months after Margaret's death, Richard sat in his therapist's office for the first time. Dr. Sarah Bennett had seen many successful people in crisis, but Richard's case was unique. "I lost everything," he said, staring at the floor. "My company, my reputation, my family." "Did you lose them?" Dr. Bennett asked. "Or did you give them away?" Before Richard could answer, his phone buzzed. Another rejected meeting request from a former business associate. He turned the phone off. "When was the last time you talked to Julia?" the therapist asked. 3 months ago. She won't take my calls." "And when was the last time you visited Margaret's grave?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I haven't been back since the funeral." Walking home from therapy, Richard passed the public library where Margaret had spent countless evenings teaching adult literacy classes. A banner caught his eye. Miller Enterprises Educational Center, grand opening next week. Through the window, he saw someone he recognized. James Porter, the businessman who spoke at Margaret's funeral. Porter was teaching a group of adults, just like Margaret used to do. "Mr. Miller?" A voice behind him made him turn. An elderly man stood there, tears in his eyes. "You probably don't remember me. I was the night janitor at your first office building. Mrs. Miller taught me to read 30 years ago." Richard remembered. Margaret would stay late, teaching the cleaning staff after hours. "My grandson just got accepted into Miller Enterprises scholarship program," the man continued. "Your daughter is carrying on Mrs. Miller's work." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He found himself looking through old photos. Margaret teaching him at their kitchen table, patiently explaining business terms he couldn't read. Her smile never wavered, even when he got frustrated. The next morning, Richard did something he hadn't done in months. He read the business section. Miller Enterprises was featured again. Julia had launched a national expansion of their education programs. The stock had hit an all-time high. Without thinking, he took a taxi to the company headquarters. In the lobby, everything had changed. Photos of Margaret teaching lined the walls. A sign announced free evening classes for employees. "Can I help you, sir?" the receptionist asked. I was just looking," Richard replied, turning to leave. "Dad?" Julia stood by the elevators, watching him. For a moment, neither spoke. "The foundation is hosting an event tonight," Julia finally said. "Former students sharing their stories." Richard nodded and walked out. But instead of going home, he found himself at the cemetery. Margaret's grave was covered with fresh flowers. Notes from students were tucked between the blooms. He knelt and touched the headstone. "You were right," he whispered, "about everything." That evening, Richard stood at the back of the foundation's event hall. One by one, people shared how Margaret had changed their lives. Doctors, teachers, business owners, all former students. "She never gave up on anyone," a young executive said, "even when we gave up on ourselves." Richard slipped out before Julia could see him. But the next day he called Dr. Bennett to schedule another appointment. "I want to make things right," he told her. "I just don't know how." "Start small," she advised. What would Margaret do? That afternoon, Richard walked into the new educational center. The receptionist looked surprised to see him. I'd like to volunteer," he said quietly, "if you need help." The center's director recognized him immediately. She'd been one of Margaret's first students. "We always need tutors," she said. "But are you sure?" Richard looked at Margaret's photo on the wall, remembering those long nights at their kitchen table. "Yes," he replied. "It's time I learned how to teach." Richard's first day as a volunteer started awkwardly. Students whispered when he walked in. Everyone knew who he was. Some even got up to leave. "Mr. Miller will be helping with our business English class," the center director announced. Nobody raised their hand when she asked for volunteers to work with him. Finally, a young man in a janitor's uniform stayed behind. "I'm Miguel," he said. "I want to start my own cleaning company, but I can't understand the contract forms." Richard opened the sample contracts, remembering how Margaret had taught him these same documents 30 years ago. His hands shook as he began explaining the terms. 2 hours later, Miguel understood his first business contract. His smile reminded Richard of himself, decades ago, when Margaret helped him comprehend his first real estate agreement. Word spread through the center. By the end of the week, 3 more students joined Richard's business English group. Then 5 more the next week. One evening, Julia stopped by the center unexpectedly. She stood in the doorway, watching her father help a group of students understand mortgage documents. "He comes every day," the director told her. "Stays late, just like your mother used to." Julia left without letting Richard see her. But the next morning, new business textbooks arrived at the center with a note, "For Dad's class." Richard's students started succeeding. Miguel won his first commercial cleaning contract. Another student got promoted after finally being able to write professional emails. A third started her own catering business. The local newspaper ran a small story. "Former CEO teaches business skills to adult learners." Richard didn't give any interviews. Instead, he asked them to feature his students' successes. One day, Harold visited the center with some papers for Richard to sign. He found him surrounded by students explaining business insurance terms. "Margaret would be proud," Harold said quietly. "I'm not doing this for Margaret," Richard replied, "or for Julia. I'm doing it because I finally understand what they knew all along." 9 months after Margaret's death, the center organized a graduation ceremony. 25 of Richard's students had completed the business English program. Miguel gave a speech. "Mr. Miller taught us more than business terms," he said. "He taught us that it's never too late to change, never too late to learn, never too late to become better." Julia sat in the back of the ceremony. She watched her father hand out certificates, saw how his students respected him, not for his money or power, but for his teaching. After the ceremony, Richard found a note in his volunteer mailbox. "Dinner tomorrow? Julia." They met at their old family restaurant. Both ordered Margaret's favorite dish. "Your students speak highly of you," Julia said. "I'm just passing on what your mother taught me," Richard replied. "I should have done it years ago." "The foundation is opening 3 new centers next month," Julia mentioned. "We need someone to develop the business education curriculum." Richard looked up from his plate. "Are you offering me a job?" "A volunteer position," Julia corrected, "with long hours, no pay, and lots of students who need help." For the first time in months, Richard smiled. "When do I start?" The next day, Richard walked into Miller Enterprises for the first time since the will reading. Employees stopped whispering when they saw him. Something in his demeanor had changed. In Julia's office, his old office, they spent hours planning the new curriculum. On her wall, Margaret's photo watched over them as father and daughter worked together, finally teaching the same lessons she had believed in all along. That evening, Richard visited Margaret's grave again. But this time, instead of regret, he felt something different. Purpose. 1 year after Margaret's death, the Margaret Miller Foundation held its first annual gala. The Chicago Convention Center was filled with students, teachers, and business leaders from across the country. Julia took the stage to welcome the guests. "A year ago, my mother left us with a mission: to create opportunities through education. Tonight, we celebrate not just her memory, but the thousands of lives changed by her vision." The screens showed the foundation's achievements: 50,000 adults enrolled in education programs, 30 new learning centers opened, and over 100 successful small businesses started by program graduates. Richard sat quietly in the audience, surrounded by his students. Miguel, now owner of a growing cleaning company with 30 employees, sat to his right. On his left was Sarah, who had just opened her second restaurant. "And now," Julia announced, "the Chicago Business Association's Entrepreneur of the Year, Miguel Ramirez." Miguel squeezed Richard's shoulder before walking to the stage. "A year ago, I was a janitor who couldn't read a contract," he told the crowd. "Today, my company provides jobs for 30 families. This wouldn't be possible without 2 teachers, Mrs. Miller, who inspired the foundation, and Mr. Miller, who showed us it's never too late to learn." As applause filled the room, a commotion at the entrance caught everyone's attention. Ashley Williams walked in, her designer clothes now looking worn. "I have a right to be here," she announced to the security guards. "I was almost part of this family." The room fell silent. Julia started to signal security, but Richard stood up. "Ashley," he said calmly, "this event is about celebrating education and achievement. You're welcome to stay as a student. We have excellent programs that could help you build an honest career." Ashley stared at him, then at the crowd of successful students. Without another word, she turned and left. Julia returned to the podium. "Tonight, we're announcing our biggest initiative yet. The Margaret Miller Foundation will partner with 50 companies nationwide to provide education and business opportunities for their employees." The announcement received a standing ovation. Business leaders lined up to sign partnership agreements. Between presentations, a video played showing Margaret teaching adult literacy classes throughout her career. Richard watched his younger self in some clips, sitting at their kitchen table learning to read. "I never thanked her properly," he whispered to Julia, who had sat next to him. "She knew," Julia replied. "She saw it in every student you help now." The evening ended with an unexpected announcement. The governor declared Margaret's birthday would become Adult Education Day in Illinois. 3 other states had already agreed to follow suit. After the gala, Richard and Julia walked through the foundation's main center. Night classes were still in session, the rooms filled with students working toward their dreams. "Mom would love this," Julia said, watching a retired teacher helping a young immigrant learn English. "She does love it," Richard corrected. "She's here in every student who learns to read, every dream that comes true, every life that changes." They stopped at Margaret's photo in the lobby. A new plaque beneath it read, "Education is not just about reading and writing, it's about dignity, opportunity, and the courage to change." Richard touched the plaque gently. "Your mother taught me to read, but she spent her life teaching me much more important lessons. I just wish I had learned them sooner." "You learned them, Dad," Julia said. "That's what matters." Outside, the city lights illuminated the foundation's name atop the building. Inside, people continued learning, growing, and changing, just as Margaret had always believed they could. The true legacy of Margaret Miller lived on, not in buildings or bank accounts, but in the countless lives transformed by the power of education and the courage to change. If you enjoyed this story of redemption, love, and second chances, please hit the like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Echoes for more touching stories that remind us what truly matters in life. As Margaret Miller taught us, true wealth isn't measured by what we own, but by the lives we touch and the lessons we learn along the way.